Hello, welcome. I'm Beth. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I thought I'd go through the 36 books that I read in 2024. Now, 2024 was a really good reading year for me. I was pretty consistent the entire year, other than a 2-month period where I literally read one book in the entirety of the 2 months, which wasn't ideal, but it just happens sometimes. The rest of the year though, I was actually really consistent and I was able to reach my goal, which was 36 books. For me, reading 36 books is pretty average. I usually do average around 3 books a month. Sometimes, some months, I'll end up reading 4 or 5 if I'm reading shorter books or if I have books that are 5-star reads. But in general, I'm usually getting through about a book every 10 days or so. As it would take too long for me to just go through every single book I read in detail and give a full review on all of them, I'm just going to give a couple of sentences because otherwise this video would literally be about 2 hours long. So I'm trying to make this only like a 20-minute video or something because I don't want to bore you. All the books that I really enjoyed I will be giving a proper review of, but just not in this video as it would literally take way too long. So without further ado, let's get into the 36 books that I read in 2024. The first book I read in 2024 was None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This I read on audiobook and I did enjoy it. It follows a woman who has her own podcast and she basically meets with another woman in, I can't even remember where they meet. I think they meet in a restaurant or something, in a restaurant bathroom. And it turns out they have the same birthday, and the other woman basically says to her, hey, maybe you should do a podcast about me because I'm about to do some big life changes and it might be good to podcast it live along the way. And that's the premise. You don't really know who to trust, you don't really know what's going on and who's telling the truth and who's not, because as the story progresses, you get both perspectives and the two perspectives don't exactly line up. So yeah, it's a thriller mystery. I would say it's definitely a bit more on the mystery side than the thriller because although there were some big events that happened, I didn't find it that thrilling. It was more a mystery for me. The next book I read was Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. This is a graphic novel. I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about it, but it's essentially boy meets boy graphic novel. It follows Charlie and Nick, who are classmates at school. Charlie is openly out as gay and he forms a crush on his classmate Nick. And it basically shows their relationship as their friendship that also develops into more. I don't really want to spoil anything. It's a graphic novel, so it's really, really quick to read. I think I read it in literally about 2 hours, so it's really quick to read. It was really enjoyable and I gave it a 4-star. After that, I read The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This is a young adult thriller where a teenager who's contacted to say that she has received a huge inheritance by a billionaire that she's never even met before. She's inherited all the money, the house, everything, and the grandchildren of the billionaire are trying to figure out why she's inherited the money and also trying to stop her from inheriting it. There's a lot of sort of little puzzles and mysteries as they're all trying to figure out why it was that she inherited it and the grandchildren are trying to inherit it themselves. It's very fast paced and it's young adult. There is some subplots of romance and tension and it is the first book in a trilogy, so I do want to read the rest of the series. After that, I read Heartstopper 2. I really need to read more of these because I also gave this a 4 stars. It just follows on from the book before and shows how Charlie and Nick's relationship develop. A lot of you probably will know about Heartstopper because of how viral the TV show was, but I definitely recommend reading the graphic novels. They're really quick reads and they're really sweet. I then read When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, which is a memoir documenting how he as a neurosurgeon ends up with cancer himself. It was a really sad read, but it was also interesting to learn more about the life of being a neurosurgeon and expand his whole career, so you got to understand how he got into the industry. If you're into your medical non-fiction, you'd probably really enjoy it. I've just never found it completely interesting and some of the medical jargon I found a little bit boring, so this one just wasn't really for me. I'm actually jumping in here because as I was editing, I realised that I actually didn't talk about what this book was about, so I thought I would just do it again. The next book I read was The Colour Purple by Alice Walker. This is a historical fiction and considered a modern classic, and it follows Celie, who is an African-American woman in the early 1900s. She is separated from her sister at a reasonably young age and is sent to live with a man that she doesn't know and doesn't trust. At the beginning of the story, Celie doesn't have any sense of self-worth, but as the story progresses, she is introduced to more women around her, and it's really inspiring and it's a very hopeful book, but it does have some heavier topics surrounding domestic violence and sexual violence. I did enjoy this book, but the time period and the way it was written, I found it a little bit less easy to read, and I also did find it a bit slow at times, but when I was into it, I really enjoyed it. I did really like the characters and the character arcs. After that, I read Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. I didn't mind this book. There were definitely aspects that I did enjoy, but I didn't realise how spice heavy it was going to be, so it just wasn't my favourite in that sense. And also I felt that I wish there was a little bit more plot and a little bit more development of the characters, because some of the character development was really interesting, but I wish they'd have just gone a bit deeper considering the page count as well. I then read A Piece of Cake by Cupcake Brown. This was one of my favourite books of the year. It's a memoir that follows a woman throughout her life from a child to an adult, and it chronicles her addiction and later sobriety. It was really inspiring, but it definitely is a very heavy memoir. If you are willing to read something that's a little bit heavier but is really inspiring, I would definitely recommend this. I don't hear anyone talking about it, and I did do a full review of this book in my last video. I then read The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren. This is my first book by Christina Lauren, and I did really enjoy it. I found it really funny and refreshing. In the world, there is a new dating app where essentially what you do is you use your DNA to find the correct match for you, and the premise is that the main scientist who's created this whole thing gets matched with our main character, and they have a super high match rating, and she gets dragged into all the press, and they're also not convinced that they should have this rating because they initially don't get on. So it's a little bit of an enemies to lovers, not really enemies, but dislike to lovers, and I really enjoyed it. I found it really funny. It's definitely one of my favourite romances of the year, and I definitely would recommend. The next book I read was Good Girl Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. This is the second book in the Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy. I don't really want to spoil much because if you haven't read the first book, I don't want to go into what happens in the rest of the trilogy, but it follows Pip again, and there's essentially another mystery that happens in the town that she wants to solve. And this one definitely does get a bit darker. This was actually my favourite in the trilogy. I just really liked the storyline, and it definitely left me guessing. I then read Send Nudes by Saba Sands. This was a book club pick, and it's a collection of short stories. I did enjoy this one. Definitely some of the short stories hit more than others. I always kind of find that with a short story collection. Girlhood mainly is the main theme. They're all very realistic. They're all very slice of life, and there definitely are some stories that are really interesting. So if you're into your short stories, I definitely would recommend this collection, especially if you're based in the UK, because a lot of them do take place in the UK, and it's quite interesting hearing that sort of cultural element as well. I then read As Good as Dead by Holly Jackson, which is the third book in the trilogy. Again, I really like this book. I love the whole series. I think out of the trilogy, the second book was my favourite. The third book definitely is a lot darker, and I've seen some people criticise that. I definitely didn't dislike the book in any sense. I still really enjoyed it, but I think the pacing was a little bit slower for me than it was in the second, so it was probably my least favourite in the series, but I still really enjoyed it, and I definitely would recommend reading the entire series because I think it's definitely rare that you get a trilogy where all the books are actually really good, and this is definitely one of those. I then read You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. I actually read this on my Kindle, but I also did listen to it a lot, and when listening to it on audiobook, it's read out by the author herself, which was really nice. This was a super inspiring self-help book. It definitely was a little bit spiritual in some senses, so if you don't really like that side of things, not as in religious, but as in the universe and stuff like that, so if that irks you, you might not like it, but that was only a small part of the book. I did just find it really inspiring, and it definitely motivated me to find my own power and live the life that I want to live. It's definitely a book that I'll be rereading in times of struggle, and I did really enjoy it. I then read Pizza Girl by Jean Kyung Fraser. This was another book that was part of my book club picks, and this one I just didn't really get on with that well. I did find the concept interesting, but I just thought it was a bit slow and not enough plot for me. There was definitely some aspects of the book that I really liked, but it just wasn't my favourite. This book follows a teenager / young adult who's working at a pizza place, and she's currently pregnant with her boyfriend's baby. It follows how throughout the pregnancy she's sort of slowly unravelling, and she ends up becoming obsessed with one of her customers. I like the concept of this book, but I did just find it a bit slow, and I didn't feel like enough happened in it to warrant a higher rating. but this was another book club pick. I then read Dial A for Aunties. This is a really wild book. It follows a woman who accidentally kills her Tinder date and then has to hide the body with the help of her aunties as they are all set to run the biggest wedding of the entire season. It's very funny and it's quite slapstick. It's a sort of book where you have to really just let go and immerse yourself in it because some of it is a bit ridiculous, but I did enjoy it, and there is a big romance element as well. I then read Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This was my first 5-star book of the year and I really loved it. I love Taylor Jenkins Reid, so pretty much most of her books are going to get a high rating from me. I've already talked about this in my last video, so if you want a full review, go check there. But it's about a woman who has retired from tennis and she finds out that there is someone who is going to potentially equalise her record or surpass it, so she decides to return to the world of tennis to stop that from happening. She's a super competitive character and it was refreshing to read about a character that maybe had this more masculine quality to her than other characters that I've read. I then read The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. This is Britney Spears' memoir. I really enjoyed this. It was definitely interesting to learn more about her life. Some parts of the book were really emotional and heartbreaking. Sometimes I wish for a little bit more because it's not the most descriptive book, and there's definitely some sections where it sort of tells you what it is and then quickly moves on, but in general I really liked it. If you're a Britney fan, I definitely recommend reading it. I then read How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water. This was another book club pick. I really enjoyed this one. It's about a woman who I think is in her 40s or 50s and she's living in New York and she's recently unemployed and she's trying to get employment checks so that she can continue to earn money while she's looking for a job. She goes to these sorts of job seekers meetings. It's really interesting to learn about her life, especially when you don't necessarily agree with everything she says. She's obviously of a different generation, but it was a sort of book where I could really hear her sense of voice when I was reading it. It talks a lot about gentrification and I found it really entertaining. I then read 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, which is about two people who were connected when they were younger for 7 days and then they then cross paths again as they're older and again connect for 7 days. It's really nice. You kind of get the present timeline as well as flashbacks to when they were teenagers and you get backstories on the two of them. They're both writers as well, so a big thing is that throughout this huge span of time between the 2 7 days, they've both been writing each other into all of their books, which is a really lovely concept. I really enjoyed this one. If you like a romance that is very sentimental and has more of a literary fiction spin to it, then I think you'll really enjoy this one. Next up was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This was again another book club pick and I did enjoy it, but I just found it a little bit too meta for me. It follows an author who dies by choking on a pancake and then her friend who's there with her at the time decides to steal her manuscript and pass it as her own. You've probably heard a lot about this book. It was a big seller. I did enjoy it, but I thought all the mentions of Twitter and stuff kind of got on my nerves a little bit, but it is interesting to learn more about the publishing industry and to kind of get a broader understanding of who are the bad people, because as much as the main character is awful, she's also influenced by a lot of the people around her, so I thought that was interesting commentary. I then read Big Little Lies by Liane Moriarty. This was my second 5-star book of the year. You've probably watched the TV show, but if you haven't, it's about a group of middle-class women in Australia and someone dies at their annual trivia night and you don't know who died and you don't know who did it, and the book starts 6 months before the trivia night and shows you all about their lives and all the secrets that they hold and the friendships that they make. I really enjoyed this. The characters were really interesting and it definitely was an interesting mystery. Even without the mystery element, I still just enjoyed the characters and the writing. This was then when I reached my reading slump. I think I just enjoyed Big Little Lies so much that I found it difficult to get into another book. I did try reading Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, but I just couldn't get into it. I didn't really get on with the writing style. And then I did end up reading One Day, which I did really love, but it just took me ages to get through, I think because the chapters were so long. One Day follows 2 young adults and every chapter is on the same day but a year later, and you follow them throughout decades of their life. It's really interesting to see how their friendship develops and their romance lingers throughout all these years. It's definitely more friendship based than romance, but there is a romantic element to their friendship and I really enjoyed it. I loved both the characters, I loved their relationship, and I'm definitely realising that I like books that span over several years. It's definitely a subtrope that I really enjoy. I then read The True Love Experiment by Christina Lauren, which is the book that comes after The Soulmate Equation. It follows Fizzy, who is the best friend of the protagonist in the first book, and she goes on to a reality dating show. They're using this DNA dating, and she essentially starts falling for her producer, so it's a bit of a forbidden romance. This was a bit of a flop for me. I thought it was very insta-love, and I just didn't enjoy it as much as The Soulmate Equation. I do want to read more Christina Lauren, but I need better recommendations because I just didn't like this one. I then went into Firefly Lane by Kristen Hanna. This book I absolutely adored. It follows two young girls throughout decades of their lives. It starts from when they're children and ends when they're in their mid-40s, and it just goes through kind of everything that happens in their lives, all the events. It reminded me of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow in that sense, that it basically follows a friendship throughout several decades. It's also very focused on girlhood and these two women's relationship and everything that comes between them and everything that brings them together. I really enjoyed it. It's a lovely story and it's very moving. I then read My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite, and I really loved this book. I had technically started reading it a few years ago, and for whatever reason I stopped it, and it meant that when I was coming back to this book I really thought I must have stopped it for a reason, that I didn't like it. So I kind of went in with that expectation, but I ended up loving it. It follows two sisters. One is a serial killer and the other sister is the main protagonist and finds herself having to always clean up after her sister. It shows their relationship as sisters and also the moral dilemma of her sister committing these murders, which she justifies by saying that the men that she kills are men that haven't treated her correctly, but obviously the protagonist starts to have moral dilemmas, especially when her sister starts to show an interest in someone the protagonist actually knows in real life. This book was really fast-paced and really short, and I definitely recommend it. I then read The Sad Ghost Club by Liza Meddings. This was really disappointing to me. It follows a individual who is a bit of an outsider. It's a graphic novel that shows their evening. They go out to a party and they are able to connect with another person who feels like an outsider. It's a graphic novel, so I understand that not much can really be covered. But once I finished it, I just wanted a bit more, and I felt like it was very surface level and didn't really cover the topic in as much detail. I think if I was slightly younger, it might have been something I would really enjoy, especially if you're going through mental health issues yourself, as that is the huge theme of the book. But for me, it just felt a little bit too young for me and a little bit surface level. But I can imagine really enjoying it when I was sort of like 16, 17. I then read Wayward by Amelia Hart. This book follows three women across different time periods that are all connected together. They all have this sort of witchy element to them, and it was really interesting. You have one who is on trial for witchcraft. You have a second who is in the sort of 1900s, who is a child and has this connection with animals. And the third is a woman who is escaping domestic violence and is able to find her own inner power. I really enjoyed it. I read it for my book club. If you like very female-centric novels, this was very interesting. It also had a historical element to it, and it is along the lines of witchcraft, so it had a sort of magical realism to it as well, which I really enjoyed. I definitely wouldn't say this book is fantasy though. It's more historical fiction, literary fiction with magical realism rather than an actual fantasy novel, so don't go in expecting that. I then read Our Wives Under the Sea, which is a book I absolutely adored. It has two timelines and it follows two women who are wives. One of them went on a undersea voyage, and one of the perspectives is her in the submarine, what actually happened when she was there, and the other is her wife talking about the aftermath of her returning and how she has changed and how their relationship is starting to deteriorate. It's really interesting to get the two perspectives. You have the present timeline where you're learning more and more about their relationship, you get flashbacks, and then you have the second timeline which shows what actually happened when she was in the submarine. It's a horror and it definitely did leave me not wanting to go in the sea and definitely not wanting to go in a submarine anytime soon. I would describe this book as haunting, heartbreaking and extremely moving, and it's very tender. I then read 5 Survive by Holly Jackson. I was clearly on my Holly Jackson hype this year. I just loved the A Good Girl's Guide to Murder series and I wanted to read more. This one was interesting. It follows a group of teenagers who break down on a road trip and find that they're being attacked by a sniper, and they don't know who to trust in the group because it seems that someone in the group might have something to do with it. This was a fast-paced thriller. I wouldn't say it was my favourite, and it wasn't as good as the Good Girl Guide to Murder series, but I did read it really quickly, and if you do like a YA thriller, I still would recommend this. I then read Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. It has 2 different timelines. One woman who is experiencing the loss of her friend who has just died due to a serial killer, and the second woman is a woman that we know is going to also die at the hands of this serial killer. It was interesting, and there's definitely elements of the book that I really enjoyed, but it is based on a real serial killer, and I think if it had just been completely fictionalized, I would have enjoyed it a lot more. I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that it was a fictionalized version of real events that happened to real women, and I got the ick about halfway through, so that's why I rated it so low. If it wasn't for my book club, I would have DNF'd it, but I did feel that I needed to finish it, especially as I was the one hosting that book club, so probably one of my least favourite books of the year. However, the rest of my book club absolutely loved it, so I think it's just a me problem. I wouldn't necessarily not recommend it, it just didn't work for me. I then read Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This is the first in the Powerless trilogy. There's also a novella that goes along with it. It's about a teenager who lives in a fantasy world where everyone has powers but she doesn't. She then ends up mistakenly saving the prince, who is the other protagonist of the novel. And because she saves him, she is then sent into the games where everyone has powers and she has to pretend that she does as well, otherwise she'd risk being killed. It's very fast paced. I like the fantasy elements, but the romance wasn't exactly my favourite. I just found it a bit cringe at times, and for me the book was strongest when it was focusing on the action, but I am still interested in continuing the series. I then read Notes on an Execution by Daniel Kafka. I really loved this book. It follows a man who's on death row and then also has perspectives of 3 women in his life and how they viewed him across the course of his life and everything that happened to lead him to this point of them being on death row. It's definitely a mystery thriller with literary fiction elements. I really liked the fact that the book spanned over several years, and I liked hearing all the different perspectives of the women and how his perspective of himself was so different to their perspective of him. I wouldn't necessarily say it was an enjoyable book, but I did really like it and I was just completely fascinated and engrossed with the story. I then read Cleopatra and Frankenstein. This is a literary fiction book that follows Cleo and Frank, who first meet in New York on New Year's Eve. They then form a relationship and the book follows that relationship and the eventual breaking down of it. There were definitely a lot of aspects of the book that I really liked, but I did just find it a little bit too heavy and a bit too sad for me. I think just the place I was, considering I'd come off the back of so many depressing books, it just wasn't the book that I needed at that time. So I didn't rate it as highly as maybe I would have done if I'd have read it at a different time, but it was still an interesting read and I'd be willing to read more by the author. I then read Beach Read by Emily Henry. I absolutely loved this book. This is about a woman who moves into her late father's lake house, and her neighbour turns out to be her college rival, who also is an author. They both decide to write in each other's genre, and it's a sort of rivals to friends to lovers. I really enjoyed this book. It was really funny, but it also had some really moving moments, especially regarding the grief of her father and how she dealt with it. It was a very funny book, lots of banter, and a really enjoyable read. I then read The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. I'd heard so much about this book and I was just in the mood for a quick thriller. This book follows Millie, who is desperate for a job and is out of work. She decides to accept a job working as a maid in a house for a rich couple with their child. However, not everything is as it seems, especially when she realises that there's a lock on the outside of her door in the attic. This definitely is a very fast-paced read and I binged it really quickly. However, the ending was a little bit lackluster for me and it wasn't the best written thriller that I've read, but it definitely served the job that it was meant to. The final book I read this year was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is a book that follows a man in Ireland in the lead up to Christmas, and he essentially finds out about the Magdalen laundries and he has a moral dilemma as to what to do because he's a very religious man and he doesn't want to get on the wrong side of the nuns, especially in the lead up to Christmas, which is such a holy time. It's very much a slice of life. There's a lot of reflection and it was just really interesting. If you don't know about the Magdalen Laundries, I definitely recommend reading this book as it's a really important part of Irish history. And it was really interesting to read and extremely moving. It's a very short read, it was only about 100 pages, but it definitely packed a punch. And that is all the 36 books that I read in 2024. If you do want to see proper reviews of all these books, I do have it all on my Instagram, so feel free to check them out there. And going forwards, I will be doing a monthly wrap up, so all my books of 2025 I will be going into depth with at the end of each month. And I'm also planning on doing a few videos throughout the year where I break down my favourite books from each genre, so you'll be hearing more about some of the books in those as well. But I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some recommendations and got to see which sort of books I rated highly and a brief synopsis as to what they were about. I'm sorry I didn't go into more depth, but I really didn't want this video to be about 2 hours long. Feel free to add in the comments if you want to know more about any of these books. I'm happy to give you some more explanation or any more details that you want, and I really hope you enjoy. If you like this video, please give it a like, and if you want to see more content from me, please do consider subscribing, and I'll hopefully see you in my next video. Bye!